Section 3.3, Three Characteristics. In addition to the Four Noble Truths, an important teaching of the Buddha is called the Three Characteristics. These are supposed to be characteristics or properties or even just perceptions or ways of looking at samsara or conditioned reality. The three characteristics of samsara are suffering, impermanence, and not self. So suffering we've already talked about. It's the first of the noble truths, dukkha. Impermanence is the idea that nothing in samsara lasts forever. It appears and then it goes away. And in Buddhism, they do believe in gods, very long-lived beings. However, even the gods don't live forever. Also, they do believe that samsara does not have a discernible beginning. So when the Buddha talks about this, he says you can go back as far as you want. You won't find a beginning to samsara. But even though you might say that samsara as a whole seems like it is forever, there's two respects in which it's not. So the beings within samsara, their states of being are always impermanent. So things come to be and pass away. And no being has an infinitely long life, for example. And with physical things too that are not sentient beings, part of the cycle of rebirth, their states of being also change. You know, like a rock is only going to last for so long, or is only going to be in one position for so long. And then the second respect in which samsara is not permanent is that it can come to an end when a sentient being realizes the end of suffering and nirvana. Samsara has come to an end for that being. And then the third characteristic of samsara is what the Buddha calls not self, or anatman in Sanskrit. So atman is the Sanskrit word for self. It's like what we saw with Hinduism, but the Buddha does not teach a true self or an eternal self. Instead, he says that all of samsara is not self. So a few things about the relations between the three characteristics. These are all seemingly interconnected. So you could understand suffering within the context of impermanence and not self, because things are impermanent and people cling to them, beings cling to them. And the fact that they're impermanent and inherently unstable is related to why there is clinging and suffering. So the fact of the impermanence might cause beings to cling to them, to try to hold on to them, but the clinging is going to be suffering. Now, another way of looking at not self is that because everything is suffering and impermanent in samsara, nothing in samsara is worthy of being identified with as self. So the not self idea here is a kind of strategy for avoiding suffering. If you identify with something as yourself, but it is impermanent or suffering, that's a bad strategy. So we'll come back to not self in a second. Just as a reminder though, these are all characteristics of conditioned existence or samsara. Samsara is called conditioned because everything that happens in samsara is based on cause and effect conditioning. So something only arises when a previous cause or condition made that possible. Example, a person is only born when their parents come together to make the baby. So that's the cause or condition for that, at least in part. The unconditioned reality is nirvana, and nirvana is not characterized by suffering or impermanence. So nirvana is a reality that actually is free from suffering and that is permanent. And the idea is the reality is already there and it's discovered by a Buddha. It's not created by a Buddha. It's already there. The Buddha discovers it. So the analogy he gives is a Buddha is like a being who is traveling through a forest or jungle and then discovers a ruined city in the midst of the forest or the jungle. So it's been forgotten or lost, but it was there the whole time. However, nirvana is still regarded as not self because it is not something you should identify with. This has to do with the Buddhist notion of what it means to have a self or be a self. According to the Buddha, having a self view involves a certain sort of craving and clinging inevitably. So that's why you would not want to regard even nirvana as your true self. So let's talk about that notion of not self a bit more. So the not self teaching is that all self views, what the Buddha calls self views or views of yourself, cause suffering. And so you should abandon them. You may have better or worse self views. So for example, it's better to have an identity, a view of yourself as a good person or as a meditator than it is to have a more negative view of yourself. But even the better or more helpful self-views are ones that are associated with craving and thus clinging, according to the Buddha. And it has to do with the product of the psychological activity behind a self-view. You could think of it as when you have a view of yourself, then there's inevitably going to be clinging there. You're going to cling to whatever you regard as your own, and you're going to have aversion to whatever threatens that. So it's going to be bound up with clinging. Now, the not self view is often explained in terms of this idea that there is no self or the self doesn't exist, but that is potentially misleading. Actually, one time the Buddha was asked point blank, do I have a self? And he just didn't answer the question. So the idea seems to be that there would be something misleading by saying you don't exist or there is no self in an absolute sense. The idea is that sentient beings or conscious beings are real. Their awareness has a reality to it. But the sense that there is a self there, that is a construct created by the awareness. And the awareness should let go of those constructs, those views of the self, because they are suffering. The Buddha does talk about two views of the self that he rejects, and they're called Eternalism and Annihilationism. Eternalism is the view that there is an unchanging, true, or eternal self. This is associated with the Hindu view of the Atman, a eternal self or a cosmic self shared by all beings. It would also be a view associated with Jainism. The ancient Jains, both ancient and modern, believe that you have a true self that is a soul, an eternal soul that's separate from all the other beings. So there's no cosmic soul, but it's a soul nonetheless. And the Buddha rejects both of those views and any other view of an unchanging eternal self. He also rejects, though, annihilationism. Annihilationism is the view that there is no self, and there's at least two sub-varieties of annihilationism. One is that there's a self while you're alive, and then when your body dies, that self is annihilated. A second version of annihilationism is that there is no self at all, whether during life or after, because what we think of as a living being is actually just a way of referring to a collection of material elements that don't have an essential unity to them. This gets into somewhat complex philosophy. This sort of thinking that the Buddha teaches neither eternalism nor annihilationism, so it must be something else, is actually the basis for much of the different Buddhist schools of thought, the Buddhist schools of philosophy that developed in the centuries after the time of the Buddha. And we'll be talking about some of those later. But the important point is that the Buddha is rejecting both of these. So his actual view is something that can't be either eternalist or annihilationist. Now, it's somewhat ironic because a lot of people, when they explain the teaching of the Buddha, they actually present it as the second form of annihilationism, 2b on this slide. But the Buddha doesn't actually say that beings don't exist in any sense, or that they're just a random collection of elements. Instead, he defines sentient beings in terms of a cause-effect process. So there's an awareness there, and what you're aware of is conditioned over time by your past actions or choices. So this gets to the issue of how the Buddha does define a sentient being. A sentient being is a being with sentience or consciousness, and all those beings also have karma, according to Buddhism. So these are the beings that are reborn within samsara based on their karma. However, the Buddha does not teach that these beings are or have eternal souls. There is no Atman or Jiva Atman or Purusha that is a pure eternal substance that exists over time. Instead, the sentient beings are more like a flow or a process of phenomena. So the Buddha does define a sentient being as something dependent upon karma, consciousness, and craving. He also gives an analogy in which karma is compared to a field, consciousness he compares to a seed planted within the field, and craving is like moisture. So this is a complex metaphor, but one way of understanding this is that karma is a field of possibilities. Not all of those possibilities are going to come to fruition. Which of the karmic possibilities come to fruition in part depend upon your craving, i.e., which of those seeds get moisture or nourishment and are thus grown. So there's a lot of things going on with this metaphor, but one thing that's worth highlighting is that karma is not quite the same as fate or destiny. The idea seems to be that your past actions will tend to have an influence on your experiences, but in addition, you have to pay attention to your craving right now, your karma right now, as you might say. So karma operates on different timescales. The karma that you're doing right now can affect both your present experience as well as your future experience during this life and your experience during a future life. So there's three main timescales that karma operates on. And because of that, that explains why not all of these possibilities in the field come to fruition. It really depends upon which ones you're nourishing with your craving. The Buddha gives another simile or analogy for a sentient being. He compares it to milk, which is allowed to sit and turn into curds that then are churned into butter. So the idea here is that there are different properties in the milk curds, and the butter. They have a different color. The milk might be white, the butter could be a yellowish color. They have different texture. The milk is liquid, the butter is solid. They have different taste, and so on. And the idea here is that a sentient being is going to have different properties over time. So that's partly why the Buddha rejects a theory of the soul, which has some true eternal nature that's fixed over time. Like in Hinduism, they say your soul already is real, conscious, and blissful. You're just not aware of it. The Buddha rejects that. His view seems to be that you have these different potentials within you, and what you are changes over time based on your own actions. What there is a causal continuity between your actions at a given point in time and what emerges later. So by analogy, your current actions, your karma, will influence your future experience. So it'll transform your experience, just like milk gets transformed into butter.